Okay, here's a slightly different topic because you and I met at Tassajara
Hmm.
over the summer, and Tassajara is an American Zen monastery, and we talked a little bit about how it was different. People ask me about what's the difference between Buddhism in Japan and Buddhism in America, and I have my answers, but I'd like to kind of hear your answers. I think you have more experience in Japan than America, though. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear
And
what you have to say.
you mean just like differences besides having free coffee and
Well, that's valid too. The
eating
the
tacos?
free coffee and the tacos. Well, that's summer. I think in the summer guest period at Tassajara, as you know, but I'll explain it for the viewers. There are guests there as well as the monastics. So the monastics' job becomes over the summer to cater to the guests in a sort of almost like a hotel or resort type setting. So I think during the periods where it's closed to guests, I know there's still free coffee because I've asked. Um,
Really? I hear there's not free coffee there.
oh,
I asked.
oh, is that
Yeah.
true? Maybe they've changed, or maybe I got that bit wrong. Um, So there's no free coffee.
During
Okay.
Rango, you have to. I heard you have to make it because I asked. It was the one thing I asked about Rango period. What
Okay.
is the deal with the coffee?
Okay, so I got that wrong. But I know there's no tacos and,
Yeah.
and stuff,
Yeah.
and there's no ice cream.
Yeah.
Well, there's no ice cream anyway, but,
You weren't there
there's...
for the Joy event. There was
Oh,
ice
right,
cream.
there's ice cream sometimes. But they don't have a freezer at Tassajara, or a toaster. I thought those two were kind of... I mean, I understand the freezer, but I kind of like... I'm kind of surprised that they made like an executive decision not to have a toaster at Tassajara.
Um. So differences.
Yeah, yeah, differences. Sorry, a little tangential there.
Well, I can think of two, and one is kind of trickier because I practiced two places. One was men and women, and one was all women. And the one with men and women is the we're talking about official Soto. I'm talking about official Soto school training monasteries, not
Right.
like a temple like Ontaiji, which is kind of its own creation, but like official monasteries. They traditionally have been uh, single sex, so
Hmm.
only men or only women. And the place I started was the first place, is the only place where men and women practice together. So this is kind of a new thing that may or may not work.
Okay,
So I
that's
would say,
interesting.
huh?
That's interesting. I thought maybe it sort of accidentally turned into a mixed practice because of, their particular situation of being so run down and all, but I didn't realize that was a deliberate sort of
No, no,
thing.
it wasn't deliberate. I asked the abbot like why it happened, and he was like, "Well, all these women kept showing up, and they kept wanting to sit zazen, so I made them a room." Um, but I think that one of the biggest differences is the separation of men and women. And so I practiced in a women's monastery for 3 years, and it's a very, very different experience practicing without men. It's like yeah, it's really different. And then, but another thing that I noticed at both places was sort of there's no space for personal life or personal time or sort of a individual subjective experience.
In a Japanese training monastery, you mean?
My experience is that yes, there is no space for your personal experience, your subjective experience to matter, to be a part of the practice.
That's interesting because I find that it's a funny thing. Um, that may be a cultural thing, but the Americans I've seen in Buddhist monasteries seem to demand that.
Hmm.
They demand that their subjective, personal, individual experience be heard, and um, yeah, I can't think of all the buzzwords. Accepted and respected and all of this, and and you go to a place like Tassajara, and they're very conscious of that, and they're very worried about it, and they're very worried about how to integrate that into the training and so forth. And I remember being kind of struck by that, because even though my training wasn't monastic in Japan, it was Japanese, you know. So Nishijima Roshi didn't really, we'd talk a little bit about my personal subjective experience and all that, because I was working a job and so forth, and married when I was over there, and that was sort of part of it. But really, when it came down to it, he was much more interested in something beyond that, you know. So there wasn't a lot of like talking about feelings and stuff, you know. So I find that's like that gets into the area of not just the physical structure of it or whatever, but actually the more deeper into what are we actually trying to do with this practice.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the culture piece is kind of, you can't ignore it. And I mean, you mentioned it might be cultural, and I mean, definitely, my friends in Japan always say that Japanese people love to hide their emotions. And it's not true of all Japanese people, but this is what, my friends would tell me, that they love to hide. And so then when you get a religion or a spiritual tradition that's talking about forgetting the self, like Dogen talks about, those two things go very well together.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because I do feel like there is a kind of general confusion in America as to what Zen is, and I think a lot of people in the U.S., including the people who are teachers, try to make it a form of therapy. This is Zen therapy. They won't say that, but they're in their mental categorization. They seem to be slotting it into the category of therapy, and so, all the things that go along with what a therapist does should be the same rules should apply to Zen teaching, which I think is a mistake, and I think it's detrimental to the practice to make it a form of therapy.
Yeah. I just am going to quote somebody else on this because I agree with what he's saying. It's this guy, Cohen Franz. He is from Montana, but he spent like 5 years training at Zuyaji Monastery, where my teacher also trained. So he writes about this same thing about therapy, and his argument is it does a disservice to both therapy and to Zen if you say they're the same thing, because they're different and they're both important. And he says, therapy is Zen if your definition of therapy is spending 20 years in the same room as your therapist, watching the therapist. And then at the end of that 20 years, the therapist suddenly prostrates to you 3 times and says, now we're both therapists. If that's your definition of therapy, then yes, Zen is therapy.
I like that.
Yes.
I like that.
Now we're both therapists.
That's too good, because I started to think of another question, and now after hearing that story, it's gone. So that's good. That's very Zen. So if it isn't therapy, is it religion? I just want your opinion on that. I have my opinion, but I'm asking.
Zen?
Yeah.
I mean, a very easy answer would be that Zen is a kind of Japanese religion, Buddhist religion.
Yeah. But do you think of it as a religious thing, practice?
I've found myself talking about it like a religion. Like I'll talk about religious practice, and I mean, I'm a nun. How could I not talk about it like religious practice?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think religion has become kind of a dirty word because of the way it's been used a lot in the West as kind of a way to bludgeon people into kind of submitting to to the order. You know, you had the Crusades and horrible things like that, where people were forcing others to follow religions they didn't necessarily want to follow or care about or know about. So, that's kind of sullied the image of religion, and I think Buddhism is slightly different.
Because there's not bludgeoning.
There's not a lot of bludgeoning. I mean, there's isolated incidents in like Myanmar and places like that I've heard of, or Sri Lanka, but I think even that's quite removed from the religious aspects of it, and it's a very new phenomenon. You know, historically there hasn't been that
In
I know
Japan,
of.
just in the last year or two, there was one monastery that closed because there was so much bullying, and this
Oh,
guy just got the shit beaten out of him, and I think he went to the police, and so they had to close the monastery, and everyone was like, "Oh, such a shame," because the monastery was like this beautiful, like 1,000-year-old monastery, and it had to get shut because, yeah, everyone was hitting each other. So I mean, bludgeoning happens literally, I would say.
yeah.